Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Bronfman Fellowship. Do you know a Jewish 11th grader who loves to learn and thinks outside the box? Tell them about the Bronfman Fellowship, a free pluralistic leadership program for Jewish teens. Bronfman Fellows explore the rich tapestry of Jewish ideas while making lifelong friendships with peers from diverse backgrounds. The program begins with an immersive experience in the Berkshires the summer before 12th grade. Applications are currently being accepted, and the deadline is December 14th. Apply today at bronfman.org. That's BRONFMAN.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 246, Priestessing, Priestesses. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And as I think I've been saying for the last bunch of series, or maybe I only said it in the last one, but I've meant it for many of them, there's this concept in the Talmud called Hadran Alach, that when you reach the end of a chapter, you say, we will return to you. And that's how I've been feeling at the end of a lot of these series that we've been doing, because we're only starting to scratch the surface. We as a podcast are going to keep returning to these subjects once we've kind of opened it up as a series, whether that's through doing another series or just here and there. And we should see these all as a whole series that's taking place over time. We're going to organize things that way on our website. But in any event, this is the last interview as part of this series on women, the question of feminism and its impact on the past, present, and future of Judaism. And so today we're actually going to close a mini loop in this series because we talked a few weeks ago to Jill Hammer and Thea Shear, the founders of Kohenet, the Hebrew Priestess Institute, which is one of these organizations that's really incredible in some of its reverberations, including our interview last week with Yael Kennerek, who is regendering the entire Torah. And so we thought we would talk to somebody who went through that priestess training program, and one could say is now representative of the next generation in the priestess movement, even as there is another generation coming up. And of course, many more to follow. Our guest today, Keshira HaLev Fife, is the Oreget Kehillah, which means, strictly speaking, community weaver of Kohenet Hebrew Priestess Institute. She describes herself as a proud Jewish woman of color who sprinkles, sparkles, disrupts expectations, and offers blessings wherever she goes. In service to the divine, to their bright and benevolent ancestors, and to those who are coming up after her, she serves as a community weaver, reclaiming ancient practices in ways that are resonant and relevant in the modern day. In addition to her work at Kohenet, Keshira HaLev Fife is the founder and leader of Kesher Pittsburgh, and more broadly, a dovenatrix, a prayer leader, life cycle ceremony officiant, ritual creatrix, liturgist, songstress, and public speaker. She has lived in both the United States and Australia, where she is a dual citizen, and now she lives in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She was ordained as a Kohenet, a Hebrew priestess, in July of 2017, and she studied social history and public policy and management at Carnegie Mellon University in her hometown of Pittsburgh. So Keshira HaLev Fife, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
So wonderful to be here with you both.
I'd love to hear a little bit about the story of how you became a Kohenet, because we talked to Jill Hammer and Thea Shear, and we heard about the founding of this new institute, this new way of being a Jewish leader. And I think in some ways this is the first time that we have an opportunity to talk to the founders of something new and then to somebody who joined it.
When I was 5 years old and began kindergarten, at circle time we were asked to stand up and say what we wanted to be when we grew up. And at that time, my frame of reference was a little smaller than it is now. So I stood up and I said I wanted to be a rabbi. And I was always encouraged in my Jewish practice and Jewish involvement. I wasn't always encouraged to pursue a rabbinical path. Fast forward to 2011, I spent most of that year unwell, in treatment and in recovery. And while I was recovering, laying around, looking out the window, musing about why young people fall ill, what came to me so strongly was that when I regained my strength and wellness, to pursue a life of service. And it came through really strongly to revisit this longstanding calling or desire. And so at that time, I was living in Australia. I came back to the United States to check out some rabbinical programs. And one of the programs was HaLev, the Alliance for Jewish Renewal. And I found myself at home immediately within the renewal context. And yet I still had lingering questions about the rabbinical ordination path. while I was there at the biennial gathering of renewal folks, I met a couple of people who were beginning something called Kohenet. I had never heard of it before. I went back to my room and I Googled it and was deeply intrigued. And I can remember I sent the link to my love, who was still in Australia. And I said to him, what do you think about this program? If I applied and was accepted, would it be doable for me to participate? Because it's 7 retreats over 3 years. I was living in Sydney. It was happening at Isabella Friedman. And he wrote back immediately and he said, you were born for this. So I applied, and the rest is history still being made.
Can you talk a little bit about why you, and perhaps why other people who have ended up going through the Kohenet program, why they make the decision to become a Kohenet and not to become a rabbi? I'm particularly curious about the distinction between the two. We talked with Jill Hammer and Keshira about it. Again, in theory, I'm also curious about the practicality of it. I've been intrigued from the very beginning about this idea of there being alternatives to being a rabbi. A lot of people feel like if they are really into Judaism and want to do something, then really their options are to go to rabbinical school or to get a PhD in Jewish studies. And so I'm so thrilled that there are other alternatives and want there to be more. But can you talk about how people assess those options and what draws them to becoming a Kohenet?
It might not be exactly the right metaphor, but I'll say if you've ever woken up with a stiff neck, sometimes you need a chiropractor and sometimes you need a massage therapist. They're 2 perfectly legitimate routes to take when looking for healing or realignment, and different folks need different things. When I arrived to Kohenet, it awakened in me a knowingness and a remembering that wasn't cognitive. That the rhythms of prayer, the ways of ritualizing, the questions that we were exploring, the willingness for the questions even to be asked, opened up something that had been previously unknown and unforeseen by me. To the question of why might people choose this path and not a rabbinic path, I think it's important to step back a little bit and widen the frame. So on one hand, the Jewish world is as it is today because of rabbinical schools and PhD programs and all of the working mechanisms that have created, for better or worse, the landscape as we know it. And there's also in the Torah white fire, that which surrounds the letters that we read. And the willingness to back up and look at a wider frame and say, okay, what is absent? What is missing? Which voices are missing? What yearnings do we have that are not met by the current state of things? And how might we respond to those, not only by innovating and bringing things into the present moment, but by looking back far enough to remember that which has been forgotten?
I want to dive into what you said about having a stiff neck. I think about a stiff neck a lot because in Bible, it says that the Israelites wandering around in the desert were stiff-necked. And even on the high holidays, there's liturgy when we're, apologizing for whatever set of sins. It says, Kishinu Oref, we were stiff-necked. And I always look at that in the liturgy and I'm like, I don't know if that's a sin. I like being stiff-necked. I think that it's kind of a worthwhile thing to have what I associate with a stiff neck, to have a sense of, I don't know, stubbornness, but not in the all the words we have are negatively inflected. To have a commitment to a set of ideals such that you would stand your ground, such that you would have a stiff neck when they're pushed. And it's not that I want everybody to be like the Israelites in the desert, fetching all the time. But I do think there's a power there. And I guess I'd kind of connect that. I mean, maybe you can correct me or you can give your take on this. I feel like the people I meet in Kohenet often are people who in the positive sense I mean, not in the negative sense, have a kind of stiff neck. They could have become rabbis. But there's a sense that nah, that's not quite it. I'm going to do a different leadership role. I'm going to be a Kohenet, and that's going to not be a lesser role. It's going to be a different role. And I guess I'm curious to hear from you. Does that land well to hear the stiff-necked idea there? Would you push back? Is it a different personality trait or something? How do individual kohanot, and maybe you, relate to that conception?
I love this question. I want to nuance it a little bit. When someone wakes up with a stiff neck and goes to a chiropractor or a massage therapist, presumably they're looking for relief from the stiffness. It's causing pain. And typically what happens, from my own experience, is that it limits my range of motion and my ability to move freely and to see in multiple directions by moving my neck with ease. I think the thing that you're describing, which I will validate for sure, is not a sense of stiff neckedness. I don't know if that's a word. Sorry. I don't know if that is a symptom of a stiff neck. I would say that's more of a function of deep rootedness, of deep knowingness of who we are and what we're about, of connection to ancestral lineages and lineages that have undergone some healing work. And to the contrary of a stiff neck, a fluidity of movement and agility that allows us to turn our heads even more than we might normally, to see where are there places that people or ideas have been unseen or perhaps even pushed away so that they not be seen. This is a point of pride for me, that the hallmark of a Kohenet is someone who is willing to bring deep presence to a situation and perception of all that needs to be perceived, not only what's on the page, or sometimes not only what's told in the story, but to listen more deeply, to read, to think critically, and also to know that our knowingness doesn't always have to just be from the neck up. Some of the institutions and mainstream think that they're doing a good job of welcoming people of color, queer folks, disabled folks, other marginalized communities, but they've missed the boat. The step forward is not to be more welcoming. It's to realize that white Ashkenazi Jews don't actually own Judaism. It's not actually theirs to discern. And I think that Kohenet as an institution and the people that are drawn to Kohenet hold that frame of Judaism. We still hold sacred so much about Judaism and Jewish practice. And yet there is a sense that my definition of tradition, which Kohenet Shemira Chandler likes to remind us is nothing more than what a few generations of our family has done. The most traditional thing about Judaism is that it's constantly changing, that we don't get to define where the parameters are. That's a collective job and also an individual relationship with the divine.
So I've been talking a lot lately with a number of different folks about what a rabbi is and also like what a rabbi should be. Those are not always the same question. Rabbis, in terms of what we want them to be, is not always the same as what they are descriptively today. And something fascinating happened in one of the conversations, something I loved, which was, I think when you are a Kohenet and people are trying to get a sense of what you do, who you are as a Kohenet, often folks like you, and we've done this too, it's like, we answer like in relationship to rabbi. Like rabbi is the thing that people have heard of and know. And then like Kohenet is a thing that's also a Jewish leadership role, but a different one. And so you like compare, contrast, rectangle, square, those two roles. What happened was I was talking with somebody about what a rabbi is, and I asked a question that I've asked a lot of people, which is, if rabbiing were a verb, if to rabbi were a verb, what would it mean? Like, what does it mean to rabbi someone? And I'm like genuinely interested in what people think they'd say to that. And the answer was awesome because it started with, I'm not sure, but I'm reminded of the idea of priestessing from Kohenet. This was not somebody who themselves is a Kohenet, actually. This was somebody who is, and this was not somebody who identifies as a woman. And so I was just like, oh my God, we've taken a positive step enough that somebody out there would be asked a question about rabbi and use a frame of reference of Kohenet, of priestess, which is like a pretty new role. And like, wow, we've reached a stage in Jewish civilization where that's a recognizable, look, it's not that everybody knows what a Kohenet is. It's not that everybody knows what a priestess is, but like we've reached a stage where like, if you're kind of if you're somebody like me who works for a Jewish organization, like you can assume that people know what a Kohenet is. And even in this case, what priestessing is to a certain extent. And then the answer went where the answer went. It was very beautiful. What is it to Kohenet? What is it to priestess? It's a comparable question to who is a Kohenet, which we've already started to get at, right? But I think it's also subtly different. What is priestessing and how do people do it?
Words originate as verbs. They are relational by nature. They become nounified. They become things. And we sometimes forget their relationality. So I love that within Kohenet, priestessing is an active verb and means many things. In some cases, we joke that you can use the verb priestessing to really mean anything. If you need someone to clean up a room, you could say, it would be a wonderful act of priestessing to create sacred space here. Priestessing in some ways could be synonymous with tending, but I mean tending in the highest form. And the thing that underlies it is that it's done on behalf of sacredness. Sweeping a floor could, in fact, be an act of sacredness, clearing a room and creating the kind of context for people to come in and pray. Priestessing could also be sitting by the bedside of someone who needs comfort or companionship and bringing full presence to the situation. Priestessing might mean drawing that sign and getting out on the street in an act of deeply convicted priestessing, raising our signs, raising our voices for justice and on behalf of marginalized people. One of the exercises of the priestess before receiving smicha is to be in deep reflection, conversation, and writing in order to derive a priestess invocation, to define for each one of us, what does priestessing mean for us, and how are we committed to tending the world?
Can you talk some about the kinds of work that Kohanot do after they get their ordination? And also, are there ways in which you imagine that over time that will and ought to change? Are there fantasies that you have about the kind of work that Kohanot will do in the Jewish world?
We have folks who had jobs before and have the same jobs after. And yet the way they do the job is fundamentally different because of the experience and the skills that they've acquired as part of Kohenet. I like to tell prospective students that if you've done a university degree, you will not find Kohenet necessarily to be more rigorous than that. However, Kohenet is spiritually rigorous. I'll be gentle and say it invites us to reflect upon long-held beliefs and practices, not to necessarily unravel and let them go, but to bring critical analysis to why are we doing these things? What are we doing? Are they resonant and relevant in the present moment? Are they in service? And how might they be brought into greater alignment with our divine connection, with our relationship to the earth, and with our values as community makers? In one way, you could say a person who was previously working in a corporate field, working as a teacher, as a nurse, an artist, a healer, a musician, those folks may come into Kohenet and out of Kohenet, and their job title might not change. I would say the depth with which they fulfill their role and the richness they bring will almost certainly change. For others of us, Kohenet is a pathway to restructuring the way that we live. I tell people that I'm a full-time priestess. That translates into working on multiple projects in multiple ways. And in all cases, I bring my skills and presence as a priestess to the task. And there is no expectation within Kohenet that people either will or won't change their vocation. There is only the prayer and blessing that the way that we move through the world be fundamentally changed.
So I remember meeting you a few times. I don't even remember where, honestly. Maybe you do. I remember a number of years ago, like we met digitally. This was before, everything Jewish was digital, but like we encountered each other in various digital spaces and in various sort of renewalish spaces, maybe renewalish being, the denomination that I'm being ordained to a rabbi through and that you mentioned going to the biennial gathering for. And I bring that up to say, like, you're much more than like holder of position, executive director of Kohenet. And I noticed on your bio on your website, you describe yourself as executive director of Kohenet, but you render it in Hebrew, Oreget Kehila, which I thought was a really cool move. I mean, honestly, it matters less to me precisely how you translate Oreget Kehila, which, you know, roughly you're putting as executive director, but more that like you're layering this word that people could hear as kind of, I don't know, stale. It's not that executive directors are like boring, terrible positions, but I think people could hear it as like, that's like an administrative task. There's the people doing sort of spiritual work, often in synagogues, for example. I mean, there's like the clergy on the one hand, and then there's the executive director, or there's the administrative folks. And I think there's a way in which implicitly you're sort of questioning that and saying, there's spiritual work here. I'm going to render it in Hebrew and layer it with some specialness. And so I'm interested in that. But I'm not just interested in that. I'm interested in all the ways that who you are, what you do is not just Kohenet. It is also all these other things that we've encountered each other through. And one, if this is a good starting point, is that I know you've been the cherished leader of a group called Keshira. It's funny because it's so close to your name, Keshira. But Keshira Fellows in HaLev, in the Jewish Renewal Movement, this group of really awesome emerging Jewish people in, 20s and 30s who are doing cool things, gathering in a cohort. But really, that's just a starting point. I'm curious how you would conceptualize what you do, how you priestess, beyond just through the role you have as Oreget Kehila, as executive director at Kohenet.
First, I want to say that the title Oreget Kehila is my role. And we do the courteous thing, which is trying to translate that into something that will be understood in the wider world. Oreget Kehila means weaver of community. And that is the truest naming of the role that I play for Kohenet. One of my favorite namings was given to me by students who call me the priestess who priestesses the priestesses. And this is a role of holding a wide container for everything that's happening. And the primary thing that I do is kind of a zoom in, zoom out, which is to hold the wide container and think about the organization, and then zoom into the individual and tend the experience. Organizations are just the sum total of their people. And so we need to balance, what does it mean as an organization to grow and thrive? And what does it mean to well tend our people? I had a realization a few years ago, which was that as a Kohenet, I would receive smicha and be able to go out into the world and do some job, some role, tending some community. And what became apparent pretty quickly is that my skill set could best be used to enable lots of other people to go out and do the same. I could certainly have an impact in a community, and I'd like to think that I have impact in the various communities in which I serve. And there's something also deeply gratifying about being able to do this in ways that support others in their parnasa and their livelihood, finding their right path, being a companion, creating community contexts in which people can connect and deepen and enhance their experiences of life. And the HaLev Keshira Fellowship, which you named, Lex, is a great example of this. I came into this role as program director at a time when I was given a structure for a fellowship, which was comprised of an opening and closing Shabbaton, or Shabbat weekend gathering, with webinars in between. And sometime between that opening Shabbaton and now, a global pandemic took hold, and we had to really adapt to meet the moment. In some ways, the fellows have thrived because we've really deepened what does it mean to be part of a fellowship cohort, to do the spiritual reflection work together in a way that's consistent and without geography as a barrier to connection. It's been gratifying and also fun and inspiring to be a fellow traveler with this group of 18 fellows who have really been through a lot together this year. I'm excited that we've just launched applications for the next cohort. And in addition to bringing in that cohort, we'll also be holding an alumni or an alumnus body so that folks can matriculate and become part of something greater that it's not just a transformational experience and then people are blessed on their way, but that they continue to be part of a movement and part of a community.
Today, I'm clearly in like a word zone. I very consistently am in like a word zone and thinking about how words sound and how they play together. But I just heard you say something, in words that struck me deeply, and I got to go there. So you said alumni or alumnix, which that's a fascinating thing because like alumni is like a Latin ending, right? And then alumnix is, I guess it's still like a Latin ending, but alumnix is a gender neutral ending that's often used for Latinx as an adjective, and more for other kinds of adjectives to describe folks who are non-binary, or just as an umbrella term for folks of many genders, so that we're not assuming all people are male, which I don't know the Latin, but I think alumni is like a masculine, you're nodding. So alumni, I think, is like a masculine Latin ending, which is not a great thing to group a bunch of people who are not necessarily male into that. Okay, so alumnix. Let's talk about Kohenet as an amazing, awesome institution that I think has been really thoughtful about how we think about this role, which, it's Kohenet. It's consciously created as that et being a feminine ending in Hebrew, differentiating it from Kohen, a masculine role in the Bible and even in later iterations of Judaism. But there's also a way in which in recent years, maybe even farther back, I don't know, you've started to understand yourselves not only as being an organization for women, but also for folks who are non-binary. I'd love to hear, is that something where like your programming, your curriculum has like really consciously shifted in X, Y, or Z ways? Or is it just like, well, we actually were going about things in a way that didn't require such active shifts? It was like, how has that been for your organization? And maybe to the extent you want to do this too, like, how would we think more broadly beyond just Kohenet as a Jewish community about creating spaces that may have once been women-centered spaces, but are now becoming women and non-binary spaces?
I think the first distinction that's useful to make is that Kohenet as an institution, as a community, and as a movement, we could focus on the what are we doing, and we could focus on the who's doing the doing. And in my view, in order to comprise wholeness, we need to balance those things. So that is to say, the program did start out with the naming and continues to hold the naming Kohenet, which is a feminized version of the word Kohen. And part of that is a reclamation. We know that there were Kohanot in times past, and we could be polite and say perhaps they've been forgotten. I think more realistic would be to say that they have been erased or redacted. There's necessity to do the reclaiming. At the time that Kohenet was founded, this was a bold, big claim. I think that Taya and Jill said in the podcast that they recorded with you, they were prepared to be accused of heresy. It's now 15 years later, and there is a Talmudic teaching which says that where there is doubt about what to do, look out on the street and see what the people are doing. So Kohenet is in a moment now, in some ways we're catching up to the naming of what's going on the street. Our applicants over time have become more diverse. We take this as a testament to doing the kind of work that is creating the world as we wish it to be. It's incumbent upon us to respond to that and be responsive in our leadership. The other thing that's worth naming is that Kohenet is a 3-year program. So much can change over 3 years, including people's own understanding of themselves, particularly when they're doing intensive spiritual and reflective work. So as a person and as a community that values relationship before task, we always ask questions to grapple with and be with from a heart-centered and curious place. And where there is resistance, what might need to be healed in order for us to show up ever more to doing the work that we're called to do?
I'm thinking about another another scene from the Talmud that B'nai, Lappy, and I talk about on our show that we do called the Oral Talmud. I'm coming to think more and more that it's one of the most important scenes in the entire Talmud, maybe in its own time and certainly for ours, where it's this moment where the kind of head of the yeshiva, the head of the rabbinic school in the old days, the early days of rabbinic Judaism, Rabban Gamliel, is thrown out of his position. And as a result of that, they remove the guards from the gates to the house of study, and these people flood in who were being kept out for whatever reason before. That's an important moment, but the really important moment is, I think, the first thing they do is they take up a question about somebody who wants to become Jewish, who is from the Ammonites, which was another people, which the Torah explicitly says they may not ever become Jewish. They may not ever join the community of Israel. And they take up this question whether this person can join. According to the Torah, the answer would be clear, no. And they conclude that the answer is yes. And so, meaning that what happens when you start to let people in who are being kept out is the first thing they do is let more people in. And for some people, that's something to be afraid of. And for other people, that's something to be very inspired by. For me, it's something to be inspired by. The reason I bring all that up is because you said something early on where we were talking about Kohenet, which after all is founded to be an organization initially for women. And you said something in reflecting about it that really the big idea here is that it's not about being inviting or including of people. It's about saying that Ashkenazi, white Ashkenazi Jews don't own Judaism. And it struck me that was happening naturally, right? That an organization that's sort of created to be built around the experience of those for whom Judaism was not built around their experience previously are taking up the mantle of saying, how do we let more people in? How do we really expand the understanding of what Judaism is beyond gender? And so I'd love to go even further than Lex's question and ask you to reflect a little bit about whether it's about Kohenet or whether it's about other phenomena that you see happening in the Jewish world today. I mean, I think about all the LGBT organizations, which are also doing, not only are they interested in letting more people in, and in being liberatory spaces for other people, but a lot of people who were not connecting to existing Jewish organizations find what those organizations are doing to be very attractive. And then it's a concern because there's a lot of, straight white men that want to come to this LGBT organization. They say, wait a second, that's not really what it's about, and so how do we also manage that what is created by those who had previously been marginalized is often just got a gravitational attraction because it's right. It's deeply resonant and not only for that particular group, but then it potentially unleashes something bigger. But I kind of feel a little bit jealous of things like Kohenet because I feel like I also want to not become a rabbi, but to have something that I can be. And there isn't really that much out there, so I mean, maybe we'll create it, but I'm still curious about how you think about that.
I think the Talmudic story that you point to illustrates that we can understand sacred text to be prescriptive or descriptive. And I understand it to be descriptive. It was describing who was keeping who out at the time. And then what happens is that if it serves those in power to keep it that way, then suddenly it becomes instructive or prescriptive and gets stuck like that. We're trying to shift that paradigm. We're trying to unravel some of that, primarily because so many of us have been on the receiving end of the slamming gates. And that connects to the latter part of what you said, which is that these organizations who are doing this liberatory work suddenly become attractive for various reasons. Part of the healing that's needed is in the willingness to allow space for those that have been on the margins to really move to the center. I have a revered teacher, Stephen Jenkinson, who teaches that the best way to love a mountain is not to walk on it. That is to say that if you truly love what you're seeing, by all means, come and pray with us, come and celebrate with us, allow yourself to be led by us so that we can thrive. because otherwise what happens is that the care and love ends up smothering or cannibalizing that which we claim to love. My own understanding of Judaism and perhaps what goes awry within the wider structure is that I don't need somebody to validate my Judaism. I never have. And yet, for decades, other people implicitly insisted that I did. And I'm speaking from the I, but I mean broadly, this is the experience of many marginalized people. I teach a class called On Solid Ground, Fundamentals of Judaism. And the class is roughly akin to a 101, what might you need to know about Judaism in order to participate, and also brings in an anti-oppressive lens. So I kind of flip back and forth between saying, traditionally, or in the mainstream, here's how it goes. And here are some questions for consideration before we just buy into that paradigm. A simple example of this that I would offer, recognizing that this will not jive in some Jewish circles, is that if I ask a rabbi, how do I eat Jewishly? I'm likely to be asked, what am I eating? And then told the bracha, the blessing, to say prior to eating whatever that thing is. I rather think that if I'm a Jewish person, eating in alignment with my values, consistent with deep consideration for animal rights, for the earth, the level of conversation I'm having when I eat, what I was doing while preparing the food, who I'm welcoming at my table, I'm inherently eating Jewishly, whether I've said a bracha or not. I teach my students that saying a bracha elevates the act of eating and brings more sacredness and holiness. But if you've eaten without saying the bracha, it doesn't invalidate your Judaism. And yet, I cannot tell you how many people approach me and say, I'm Jewish, but, and then insert whatever thing makes them feel lesser than their perception of how, quote unquote, real Jews or more observant Jews do it. This is not only a disservice to the individual, but it's a disservice to the collective. It makes me wonder sometimes, after all the people are done invalidating their own Judaism, who's left to actually draw those parameters and say this is how it should be?
Well, it feels like there are two questions, right? There's, like you say, who is left. Something that I think I've been saying, I think we've both been saying for a long time, that when you think about who really feels super comfortable in their approach to Judaism and who's sort of making all the rules that is making everybody feel bad, it's actually a tiny minority of Jews. And the question is how to get that silent majority to not see themselves as a silent majority of bad Jews, but actually to see themselves as a silent majority of good Jews who have an alternative way of being Jewish. The problem is it's like Anna Karenina, all unhappy families are unhappy in different ways. How can we get the unhappy families to all band together, even though they're unhappy for different reasons? And that I feel is like part of the project. And I feel like part of the project is people like you and me, I think, who I also feel like I've never felt my own Judaism was invalid. But most people like me do feel that way. And most people like you do feel that way. And so the question is, those of us who, for whatever reason of like birth, of a certain way we grew up, of some kind of something that's like inherent in our personalities that happen not to feel that way, what is it that we can do to help others who don't have that inborn trait, to feel like, no, your approach really is valid. You really are valid as a Jew. Do you have particular things that you do on that score, or thoughts that you imagine we should be doing?
There's a bigger framing issue, I think. And we've talked about this a little bit in the past, and it references my favorite episode with B'nai Lappi, talking about institutional crash and the various options. I'm an option 3 person, carrying the jewels of tradition forward while integrating them with what's happening now. I've long been a believer that our institutions, even though their strength in numbers, run a risk when they get too big. I've been predicting for some time that we'll eventually end up with Stiebels again. For some of the reasons that you name, it's nigh impossible to gather the silent majority and get agreement on really anything. But in small groups, and Kohenet is one of those small groups where we find our people, where we find our kindreds, and there's a sense of being at home in our practice, in our conventions, in our ways of life. And maybe a good way forward would be to encourage and seed more of these communities to strengthen themselves so that the people inside them can thrive. That seems to be a stronger proposition than trying to reform everybody into how we might otherwise be.
So it's really easy with an organization as layered as Kohenet to focus on, for lack of a better term, like the content of it, like all the questions we've done, the who is a Kohenet, the what is priestessing. I'm interested in a structure thing of Kohenet that is not unique to Kohenet, but that I think you'd bring an interesting lens to. In the pandemic, and even before, but especially in the pandemic, Dan and I have been thinking a lot about not just digital Judaism, not just like the fact that Judaism is living digitally even more now than it was pre-pandemic, but like what that means for geography, for like Jewish geography. What does it mean to even live in like one quote unquote Jewish community? Like I live in Providence, Rhode Island. I live in that Jewish community. But like to what extent does that mean anything right now when I can access every synagogue on the planet, or I mean anyone that's doing digital service, which is probably over 1,000. Like, what does it mean to like be in a Jewish community? All of those words in quotes. And I'm interested in hearing from organizations like Kohenet that already have been transgeographic. Dana often talks about how like when you're wandering in the desert, the way you figure out what to do is you ask the people that have already been in the desert wandering for a while. Like that's where you learn. We're in that desert wandering time period of Judaism. That's one of the core premises of our show. So you're part of this project where you can go on the Kohenet website and you can see, wow, people have been ordained in like different continents, and within the United States, here's the West Coast and here's the East Coast. And all of those people, it's not as if you set up little buildings in 70 different cities around the world. Like they've been doing a program that involves, like you said, retreats where they do gather, at least pre-pandemic, and is largely decentralized. And so I'm curious, like sort of to use your language of descriptive and prescriptive, like what is it descriptively to be a transgeographic organization, but also for the future of Judaism, for the future of the world to some extent, what could it be if we actually saw that transgeographicness not as like a temporary thing brought to us by pandemic, which it certainly isn't for Kohenet and for other organizations, but actually a model for moving forward where all those questions of what is Jewish community become new? How would you approach that?
I was reflecting on this yesterday and thinking about when we ask the right question, or when we ask a potent question, sometimes we receive a response greater than the question we asked. And I was talking about this specifically with regards to Kohenet, because for 14 years, the Kohenet community met twice a year on the East Coast. And for the last 5-ish years, twice a year on the West Coast. And priestesses and allies and loved ones were invited to join us for Shabbat 4 times a year. And in between, we would gather for virtual temple classes as people signed up for them. Not everybody is in the virtual temple all the time. When the pandemic began, the question at hand was, how are we going to weather quarantine when we can't meet in person for our retreats? And we began to adapt the retreat structure in order to create an experience. We certainly couldn't create the same experience, but we could create a good experience. What arose was the awareness that people need and yearn for connection. And so we began to daven, to gather for prayers every Friday night and every Saturday morning, Shabbat morning, and also to have Torah study every week. So while we were trying to figure out how to salvage a training program that couldn't meet in person, the byproduct of our thinking broadly has strengthened and deepened our community beyond what we thought possible. I cannot tell you how many times in the last 7 months I've had a moment where I've thought this would not have happened in the normal course of events. That people are able to come to Shiva calls, to baby namings, to be together to read from Torah and to learn not just with people who happen to be down the street or are part of the same congregation because there's enough shared values for us to be there, but because there is genuine kindredness. And there's something really powerful there. When we take geography out of the equation, suddenly we find ourselves with people who understand us and who we understand. And that really comes as a result of this continued touch point of people coming together. I was assigned Jewish secular at birth and have grown up to be Jewish nonconforming. I was named at Road of Shalom, the Reform temple of the Pittsburgh platform, which began Reform Judaism in the United States. As a kindergartner, I was enrolled in Sunday school at Tree of Life, congregation where I grew up, had my bat mitzvah, and was married in the chapel. And I came to understand only in 2004 that my great-great-grandfather and his brother were among the founding members of an Orthodox congregation. I found out as it was closing. And the reason I found out was because my father and other members of my family were involved in the maintenance of a cemetery, which in some ways I have inherited and now manage, this Orthodox cemetery. The reason I'm sharing this anecdote is that the Torahs from that congregation, one of them is now in my possession and was probably not opened much between 2004 and the beginning of this pandemic. This Torah now resides in my home, and virtually every week we open this Torah, and I follow with a cinnamon quill yad, while Rav Kohenet Ye'ilah, or one of our other community members, lanes from another location entirely. My ancestors couldn't have imagined that someone who looks like me would be unrolling the Torah, let alone doing it on Zoom with people across time and space receiving its wisdom. There are many people in the world, I'm sure, who would shake their heads at the thought of this happening. And yet I can't help but marvel about the ways in which we are re-enlivening Judaism. This Torah has life again, is being rolled and read from each week. People are being called to the Torah and receiving blessing each Shabbat. And it's only possible because we can do this without regard to geography. The technology has allowed, and the circumstance has invited us to prioritize and be there to make it happen. It's a beautiful thing that's happening, and I'm naming it so that I can share it and also so that I can remember what's possible when we really open our hands and let go of all the preconceived notions of how things have to be. We make room for what's possible to become.
So we didn't plan this out when we scheduled the order of our episodes, but as you just spoke to your connection to the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, it occurred to me, and I'm sure this is present for you, that this week is the Yurtzeit week, the anniversary week of that shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue building in Pittsburgh. And so I'd love to just hear from you what that moment, what that anniversary means as it arises this year, and to the extent that it connects to other conversation threads that we've had about Kohenet, about the future of Judaism, really whatever arises as we close out. I'd love to hear your testimony.
I often say that leadership is conferred by followership or by the willingness to rise to the occasion. And I was deeply moved to realize following October 27th that my leadership was conferred as a result of my showing up to tend this community, individuals within it, families, and wider circles, as a function of my presence and service. In the days that followed, very few people were concerned about my credentials. And it made me realize what a luxury and privilege it is to have conversations about who's valid, who's legitimate, who belongs and who doesn't. That really, if we were to allow ourselves to get to the heart of the matter and consider the state of our world, we would focus our attention on the ways in which we can work together rather than what separates us.
Thank you so much, Keshira, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We know that this episode ended in a very different way than we normally do, by thinking back to that moment 2 years ago, the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue building in Pittsburgh, and reflecting on what it meant for our guest. And we hope that you will be able to do that too. This is an important anniversary. It's October 29th as we release this episode, October 29th, 2020. And October 27th, 2018 was only 2 years ago. We hope that all of us can take a second and sit with that moment this week and moving forward. The last thing for this episode is that we always like to encourage folks to be in touch with us with any thoughts, questions, ideas you have about this episode, our other episodes, Judaism in general, all of it. And you can be in touch with us in a variety of ways. First, there's our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, there are our other social media accounts, Twitter and Instagram, all Judaism Unbound. Third, there's our website, judaismunbound.com. And last but not least, there are our emails, dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. Before we go, we also wanted to say thank you to one of our sponsors. Support for this episode comes from the Ashman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Ashman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. So thanks so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.